Good evening, everyone, and welcome to class 34. This will be our second class on the covenant, though we've been talking about the covenant since we began the course 34 classes ago when we started talking about the eternal covenant that is reflected in the sequence of the Abrahamic religions. And so we've been really talking about the covenant since the get-go. But we're talking tonight about the covenant of Baha'u'llah, which is distinct and distinctive from other covenants in that, as we saw last time, it's all authenticated by documents that anyone can read and see. And we saw what happened in the past when things aren't recorded, though it could be argued, as I tried to argue myself in our presentation on the history of the Islamic religion, that all the evidence that was needed for the believers to know that Ali was the successor was there. It was recorded, but it wasn't in the Quran. And so no sense rehearsing all that now. Suffice it to say that the inviolability of the covenant of Baha'u'llah depends on a number of things besides the simple fact that you have the document of the Kitab-i-Ad, the Book of the Covenant, which appoints Abdul Baha, and the will and testament of Abdul Baha. Because even if Muhammad had written down the succession of Ali, it still depended on the followers to follow through and support Ali. And of course, the fact is that they did not. And so the covenant was challenged, the covenant of Baha'u'llah, at every turning point. And we're going to see that. And that's why the title about testing the mettle is both, we're going to have a series of metaphors and puns tonight. The mettle insofar as its strength and so on, and the fact that the chain image that we were using about the links in the covenant are made of metal. And of course, the way you make metal or steel strong is by tempering it. And you temper it by putting it in fire and then rapidly cooling it off, doing that several times. And so the image of tempering something with fire or testing something with fire is one that's used throughout the writings. And so every link in the covenant was tested and proved its merit by surviving all challenges and all of the rebellion that that transpired. And we'll look at a little of that in one session or even two or three. We can't hope to get to all of it. So I've got some slides, not a great many, but the things we're going to deal with are, some of them are quite subtle. One question, for example, that Alex and I were talking about before we started is there a degree of infallibility? In other words, we believe Baha'u'llah was infallible because he is inherently infallible. He is a manifestation of God. Abdul Baha is infallible because he was conferred infallibility by Baha'u'llah, and the same thing with the guardian, whose infallibility was conferred by Abdul Baha. The House of Justice is infallible because it was conferred by Abdul Baha. But are there difference in degree? In other words, is there such a thing as one being more infallible than the other? This is an important question, because it has to do with what is the obligation of the Baha'i community to follow every ordinance or every suggestion by the House of Justice in the same manner and with the same certitude and diligence with which you would follow something from Abdul Baha or from Baha'u'llah. So let's get started with my sharing my screen and starting with the first slide, class 34, testing the mettle of the covenant. Notice that's metal and not metal. Placing the keystone, there's another image we'll look at, another metaphor, placing the keystone in the far-flung ark. Now, what is the far-flung ark? Well, some of you may know, some of you may not, but before the evening's over, All of you will know. The three places you can look to go deeper into this, I mentioned several of them in the last class, and they're on the slide. I'm going to repeat a couple of them tonight. Again, the best course to take that goes into is much more depth than we can possibly go into is the Ruiz Study Circle Book 8, which is on the covenant, on the links, and on the challenges to those links. Very thorough course and a very well appreciated one by everyone who takes it. My own book, as I mentioned last time, God's Plan for Planet Earth, examines most of the links in depth, some of the challenges to those links, but not in great depth. It's mostly dealing with how did we get from Abdul Baha to the House of Justice? What were the various steps in that transition? We're going to look at those tonight. Another book from Palabra Press that you can purchase, The Essence of the Covenant, Features, History, and Implications, has all of the major authoritative writings that are dealing with the infallibility of the House of Justice, with the stages in the covenant, all of the, well, not all of, but most of the major discussions in the authoritative text of the faith about the covenant are contained in this very fine book. When in the future, now this is a quote that from David Rue, as I recall it, when I was on pilgrimage in 1972, which is a couple of years ago. And he was talking about how mysteriously things unfolded in the faith. And of course, we know that if you've read any of the history of the faith, you know how mysterious and how marvelous it all is, how things come together and how the testing makes it even more mysterious. So there's more to come in the, of course, the building of the World Center, but right now a good part of it is finished. And what he was talking about at the time, because at the time he said this in 72, the only part of the ark that was built was the archives building. It was nothing like it is now insofar as, well, let me not get into that. Suffice it to say that he was saying the purchasing of the land, you've got to remember that we purchased this land as we could, and people, once they knew that the Baha'is wanted the land, would hold out for the biggest bucks they can get, and only in the wisdom of the head of the faith, we wouldn't give in. We wouldn't, and so eventually they would. That's the story that he says, that when it's revealed how all this came about and how mysteriously and wonderfully, it'll be quite interesting. The same thing is true, by the way, as I mentioned last time, about the book by Adi Pahirzadeh on the Child of the Covenant, where it shows how Abdul Baha was able to endure and ultimately surpass and overcome all the incredible challenges to his authority by the covenant breakers. So we're dealing with an array of metaphors and puns. And I say pun because you've got the idea, first of all, of the testing of the metal, tempering the steel. So metal and metal is a pun. The Keystone and the Ark. Now you have two arks dealing with Mount Carmel. One is the far-flung ark, which is a term the Guardian coined to talk about the array of the buildings and their arrangement on the face of the mountain, which now exists except for the library that will be there in the future on the, looking at it on the, as it is on the left side of the ark. And so I'm talking here again, a metaphor that the House of Justice, the creation of the House of Justice was sort of the last building block in the twin institutions of the faith. And so it could be likened to an ark. And then you have the pun of ark and ark, because in the Tablet of Carmel, as some of you may be familiar, Baha'u'llah talks about sailing the Ark of the Covenant on Carmel. So the ark is, as with Noah, heralds back to that image of the ark of salvation. And then you have the ark of the covenant that the Jews carried with them, and so on. The challenges to the covenant, as I say, we'll go over some of those, just the main ones, because they still exist. And it's interesting to know what the challenges were based on and what was done with them. Once tested in fire, the steel becomes stronger. The covenant becomes inviolable by having to deal with hard questions, and we're going to look at a couple of them tonight. So here's the image of the twin institutions, the twin columns, if you will. And the keystone here, I'm likening to the House of Justice, even though it is one of the twin institutions, one being the institution of the learned, which is responsible for the teaching and protection of the cause, and the other, the executive branch, the rulers, which is the House of Justice and the subsidiary elected bodies, such as the National Spiritual Assemblies, the local spiritual assemblies. So here is that far-flung ark. Here is the archives building, and here you can see where they added to it. So most of the archives, insofar as texts are concerned, are not in this building. Most of the precious things are underground here, or at least that's my understanding. This is the, this is the Center for the Study of the Text. This is the House of Justice, the Keystone, as you can see in this arc. And this is the center, the teaching center, where the IT team meets and where all kinds of activities occur. And down here, I think, is where the library will go, which is one of the dependencies of the World Center. So what are the challenging questions? One of them is, can there be a guardian without a House of Justice? Can there be a House of Justice without a guardian? Should be a question mark there. Is every decision of the House of Justice infallible, or only their legislative decisions? This was a question that came up about a decade ago and caused some furor in Europe, not much in the United States. Why was Mason Remy's backwards logic flawed? Well, the fact is it's backwards is, of course, for one thing, but what was his reasoning that whereby he claimed, and there's not a question mark there either, to be the successor to the guardian? He was a long-standing and beloved hand of the cause, contributed his whole life to the cause, and suddenly became ambitious. And why that is, we'll never know. But we do know what the result was. What was so humbling and wise about the decision of the hands regarding the election of the House of Justice? We'll get to that in a second. And that is, well, we'll get to it one day. What are the twin institutions and how are they embodied? And I just mentioned those. And that is, on the one hand, you have the the institution of the learned, and on the other hand, you have the institution of the rulers, and they are bound together at the top by the institutions of the guardianship and the House of Justice. How each of the four institutions played a crucial role. Now, this may not be familiar to you if you didn't see last week's class, but in last week we discussed what were the four institutions that Abdu'l-Baha was responsible for either creating or defining and describing how they would come into being, what the parameters of their authority are, and so on. These you will see tonight, all four of them become absolutely crucial in sustaining the covenant through test. The timeline that we're going to look at tonight begins, of course, with the guardianship appointed, and that's one of the four institutions created by Abdu'l-Baha, though anticipated in the Agdas. And that's in 1921, though the will was not read, and as we said said last week, until January of 1922, but effectively then begins in 1921. The teaching plans of the Guardian, 2 7-year plans and a 10-year World Crusade, There were other subsidiary plans, but these were the ones that were most well remembered. It began in 37 when he thought we were ready for a teaching plan, and continued past his demise in 1957 for the next 6 years without his physical presence. Then the first contingent of the Hands were appointed. Now that's the second institution the Abdu'l-Baha created, the Hands of the Cause. And if you remember, he said they should be appointed by the Guardian and serve the Guardian, and their function was to spread the fragrances or teach and to protect, to protect the cause against anyone who tried to destroy it. That would be someone in the cause who is trying to destroy it from within. The Guardian had really three contingents: the first in 51, the second in 52, and the third, the last, in 57. Only a month before he died. And that was the most important one in a sense, because this is the one where he called them his chief stewards, which became a very important legal term when he deceased. Now, I skipped over here. The first International Baha'i Council was appointed. What was that? This was a precursor to the House of Justice, a 9-membered body that was to reside in the Holy Land. It was appointed by Shoghi Effendi, and it was intended to help make decisions about important matters and serve him. In 1957, the Guardian died, and the custodians is one of the terms for the contingent of the Hands of the Cause, who elected from their number 9 individuals, according again to what we discussed last week, Abdu'l-Baha's guidance in the Will and Testament, where he said the Hands should elect with secret ballot, no electioneering, plurality vote, the 9 members who would serve as the custodians of the cause. Then you have in 61 the same international council, only instead of being appointed, it was elected. And it was clearly a precursor, and was meant to be, to the election of the House of Justice. And so some of the members of this Baha'i Council were women, and some were men, but there were no Hands of the Cause. And the reason for that is very simple. The Hands of the Cause, and this is what I was talking about a few slides ago, made the very wise and humble decision to say, we are not eligible to be elected to this council. And they also, therefore, would not be eligible to be elected to the House of Justice. Now, this was very important because it meant that they maintained their role as the establishment in establishing the institution of the learned, but they did not become involved in the institution of the rulers. And then the House of Justice was elected 2 years later, only this time, of course, because of the infallible interpretation of the Guardian, I believe it was, who said that by men of the House, Abdu'l-Baha was explicitly meaning men and not women, though Abdu'l-Baha said this has nothing to do with the equality of men and women, but a reason that he said when it becomes clear will be as clear as the sun at midday. And so we can guess all the reasons we want to, but the fact is that when we know, we will know we know. Because if it's clear as day, then you don't have to say, is this it? The guardianship, then, let's go over these 4 institutions and what their responsibilities were. Not all of them. This is just a sort of a very, very broad summary. The function of the Guardian was twofold. because in Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, the Guardian, both of these twin duties, these twin institutions were embodied. So the Guardian was both the interpreter of the word, and the translator of the word, which also involves interpreting, if you think about it. That this is why the House of Justice turns to the English translations of the Guardian when they want to understand what is meant by a text, rather than to the original, insofar as the texts that were translated by the Guardian. The twin institutions then were embodied in the Guardian without the House of Justice, because, as you remember last time, according to Abdul Baha, the House of Justice had to be created by another institution he created, the secondary Houses of Justice, or the National Spiritual Assemblies, as they're called today. And they didn't exist then. They hadn't been created. So that's one of the main things that the Guardian did. He started constructing, like I say, a construction foreman, in the sense that he's carrying out the blueprint of Abdul Baha by establishing pillars all over the world. And perhaps many of you have seen the map of the Guardian that he used, that he loved maps and he loved to plan. He was an incredibly organized individual. He was really a genius in so many respects. And as I've said before, he could have been the Guardian in every respect and not have been a genius, but we're very fortunate that he was, as an artist insofar as designing the buildings and the layout for Baji and for Carmel, and then in the beauteous translations he did of the writings of Baha'u'llah. But insofar as guiding administratively the construction of the NSAs, he would say we need one here and one here in this map, which I'll see if I can get a printed copy for you that I can make into a slide if you don't have access to one. He has little arrows going to all the various places so that the pillars, if you will, the NSAs would represent the totality of humankind, or as much as possible that could be gotten together at that point. He translated and interpreted the text, and so he is the last individual or institution that has the capacity to give an authoritative interpretation of the text. Now, we all can translate and interpret the text. Anyone can do that. But to do it with authority, this was something only that the Guardian can do. The House has the authority to elucidate the text. And so that's another crucial question. What's the difference between elucidation, which obviously comes from the Latin term dealing with light, to shed light on, to enlighten about. So they can enlighten us about the text, but they can't give an authoritative interpretation. So they rely on the Guardian or the guardianship to find the authoritative interpretation. The Guardian provided instructions for all the administrative processes, the elections of the NSAs, the construction of the constitutions or the bylaws, and what do you call it? I can't remember, not the Constitution, I forget what you call it. But at any rate, the election, the conducting of meetings, the overseeing devised laws, and Constitution was the word I was trying to think of. And his guidance still remains. Now, this is a very important thing to realize, that the Guardian as an individual no longer exists, nor will there ever be one. And we'll look at that rationale, why there can't be, in just a minute. But the guardianship will always be there, because his multitudinous translations and letters that are just unbelievably immense in number. We are still in the process of gathering and translating them to various languages. Into English, for example, for the ones he wrote to the East or to other countries. The second institution, the hands of the cause, the duties of the hands to teach and inspire the teaching of the cause. They were at first, for a while after the Guardian appointed the first contingent, assigned to various continents or regions, so they would inspire the teaching in various places. So I'm sure you're aware of where some of them served. It's a great story there. To protect the cause, to respond to those who would breach the covenant or attempt to disrupt the cause. And then they elected, as they were told to by Abdu'l-Baha in the Will and Testament, a body of 9 members. And then the first international council consisted of these members of the House, not House members of the Hands of the Cause, as appointed by Shoghi Effendi. While they did not need to approve the succession of the Guardian, they played a crucial role in the transition. Now, what am I talking about here? If you remember, one of their jobs, in addition to the ones we mentioned above, was if the Guardian appointed, or when the Guardian appointed a successor, they had to approve it by a vote. And if they didn't approve, then he would have to choose another other than his firstborn. There we'll get to why why he did not appoint anyone or could not. They are designated the chief stewards in the last letters he wrote about the Hands. And this was important for legal purposes because it gave them, in the eyes of the legal authorities, the right to take over the guidance of the cause, both spiritually and literally, insofar as the World Center was concerned. And so this 9-membered body, the custodians, as they're now called, and it's called the period of the interregnum, as we mentioned last time, between the death of the Guardian in 57 and the election of the House in 63, they were the chief stewards and the custodians of the cause. When I became a Baha'i in 1959, really the spring of, officially in the spring of 1960, I wasn't aware that there was anything missing. So we would get the Baha'i, World Baha'i News came out every month, and they would have the recent letters, which would really be in a telegraphic form because of the cost of sending letters at that time. I mean, not letters, but cables and so on. So it was sort of a telegraphese. They would advise the world community of how things were proceeding in the 10-year World Crusade, what problems would occur, and so on. Now, this occurred then when Mason Remy claimed to be the second Guardian. It happened so smoothly, if you will, the dealing with it. I wasn't even aware of it at the time. And I was a fairly well-informed Baha'i. I mean, I wasn't aware that it had occurred. I think I was in Spain at the time. So they began to establish the long-term institutions of the learned, and that is, they paved the way for the creation later of the institution of the counselors, who take the place. The continental counselors serve in the various continents in the same way that the Hands of the Cause served in various continents. So they then at first had auxiliary board members who served under them. And so being an auxiliary board member was a very high honor at that time, because you served a hand of the cause. And then when the numbers dwindled, the Board of Counselors was created to take their place, because there could be no more hands of the cause since they had to be appointed by the Guardian. Then they created the auxiliary board members to serve the counselors. And the counselors were appointed by the House of Justice. And now you, of course, have the ITT, the International Teaching Center, which is run by 9 counselors appointed for that duty. Third institution created by Abdu'l-Baha, the National Spiritual Assemblies, the pillars of the that uphold the supreme institution of the faith by being the electors of that institution. They are the secondary houses of justice, which means they carry on the election of the house of, not carry it on, but they are the electors of the house of justice who gather every 5 years in the Holy Land and hold the election the same way every Baha'i election is held, from the local assembly all the way up to the house of justice. No electioneering, no nominations, secret ballot, plurality vote. They oversee the administration of the cause in their nation or region. They guide the local assemblies who are under their authority. They follow the guidance from the House of Justice, both in regard to teaching and administrative matters. They protect the cause by from those who would disturb it or injure it. And of course, they do this in consultation with the House of Justice and in consultation with the counselors. The counselors are in rank higher than the National Spiritual Assemblies. And so the National Assemblies now consult regularly with the counselors who are designated for the particular continent or region. They respond to those who would breach the covenant or attempt to disrupt the cause. They devise and implement the teaching plans for the nation or region. Now, I say devise and implement because originally the House of Justice gave goals, but they let the National Assemblies devise how to carry out those goals. It was really not until we began the sequence of 5-year plans that the House of Justice itself began creating the teaching plan in all its details. And then the obligation of the National Assemblies was to carry out those plans, not create them. This saved a lot of problems, and I'll explain that in the question and answer session if you have, I don't want to get into it right now, but it's very important. And they consult with the counselors for their region or nation. Finally, the fourth creation of Abdu'l-Baha, the Universal House of Justice, as I've already said, to me, a useful, this is not from the writings, as far as I know, it's not used in the writings, but the keystone for the Ark of the Covenant, the completion of the essential framework for the world order of Baha'u'llah. This does not mean there will be no more institutions created by the House of Justice. We've seen agencies created, we've seen clusters created, we've seen the core teaching activities created, and all of the people who participate in the core activities of each community, the assistants to the auxiliary board members and the area teaching committee and so on. So governance, they provide infallible guidance to the Baha'i institutions and Baha'is worldwide. Infallible, and we saw last week in the Will and Testament that Abdu'l-Baha designates them or confers upon them that infallibility, so long as they are elected and meet as he prescribes. They implement the laws of Baha'u'llah when and where it is timely to do so. And we've mentioned that last week, that some of the laws were instituted in one area of the world before they were in another. They had to decide, and still do, when it is timely to introduce or to institute a law of Baha'u'llah, what country might be ready for it and what might not be. And so we looked through all the laws, ordinances, and exhortations of the Agdas. We see that there's so many of them that are, it'll be a long time before they can be instituted because they depend on a Baha'i community or Baha'i society. And of course, we're seeing that take place in some remote areas where the Baha'i LSA is the governing institution for a village or an area. And we can envision how that will happen in the future. The elucidation of the text. My brother had a favorite way of dealing with the distinction between elucidation and interpretation. He would respond, well, interpretation is what Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi did, and elucidation is what the House of Justice does. And of course, that's a non-answer answer, and that's why he liked to fool people with it. But I think the difference is pretty clear, and that is the elucidation, as I said, means to enlighten us about that. And so when it comes to a matter that anyone can ask any question of the House of Justice, anyone, and many of their letters, like the tablets of Baha'u'llah, are answers to questions people have raised. This happened when they came out with a lovely pamphlet on, well, if you remember about 20 years ago, they started coming out with compilations, small compilations. And then there was a 2-volume book called The Compilation of Compilation. And what they would do was elucidate the text on an issue. So if you were talking about teaching, they had a compilation on teaching, on marriage, on the covenant, on everything you can think of, many of them, and they're still coming out with them. And one of them was the infallibility of the House of Justice. After consulting the text and the infallible interpretations of Abdul Baha and the Guardian, that should be, render insights about the text and their application. That's not an authoritative quote, that's just my writing. They instigate and oversee new translations and collections of passages and tablets on specific subjects. So there is, you well know, there just came out a new collection of wonderful tablets by Abdul Baha called The Light of the World, in honor of the centenary of his passing, which this year is. And lots of talks and classes being given on Abdul Baha and what he accomplished. And so this lovely book, if you haven't gotten it, you would do well to purchase it. Beautifully put together too, I must say. The teaching and the learned, as another thing, of course, is that while they leave this largely to the oversight of the International Teaching Center and the body of 9 counselors who head that body, they get their instruction from the House of Justice. They appoint the members of the International Teaching Center. They oversee and confirm the appointments of counselors and so on. So let's finish up, though we won't finish up everything tonight, but we'll go as far as we can for about 10 more minutes. The testing of the links in the covenant. Again, as I say, it's akin to the concept of tempering steel with fire, the fire of test. Well, who were the principal instigators against the covenant? Well, we know that from the Bab to Baha'u'llah, the principal instigator was Mirza Yahya, the half-brother of Baha'u'llah. And again, I put Baha instead of Baha'u'llah. Sorry, I'll fix that up before I put these online. And Sayyid Muhammad of Isfahan. Now, what's interesting is that Mirza Yahya is the primary rebel, and he tried to kill Baha'u'llah, and ultimately Baha'u'llah had to separate himself from Mirza Yahya. But the instigator behind him, that sort of, if you will, the evil whisperer who whispered in his breast, was Sayyid Muhammad of Isfahan. He was the plotter, and Mirza Yahya was his front man, if you were. And so, as I recall, it is Sayyid Muhammad of Isfahan who is designated the Antichrist of the Baha'i, of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. I believe I'm right, I may be wrong. Then from Baha'u'llah to Abdul Baha, well, the primary instigator of rebellion was his own half-brother, Mirza Muhammad Ali. And there's so much interesting about this whole conflict, because Mirza Muhammad Ali lived a long time after the death of Abdul Baha. But he actually said to, and this is from God Passes By, he said to Abdul Baha, I will be your Omar. Now, if you remember from our study of Islam, Omar and Abu Bakr were the ones who usurped the authority of Ali by preventing Muhammad from writing a will and by immediately holding an election for a successor while Ali was not there, while he was tending to the body of his deceased cousin, really. He was the first cousin of Muhammad. Mirza Badiullah helped him out a lot. There were a lot of individuals involved in this. Even if you can imagine the amanuensis for Baha'u'llah, who was his first amanuensis, Mirza Khajan. He joined this group. It's hard to understand how it happens, but it does. It's a disease, if you will. Mirza Badiullah, the youngest son of Baha'u'llah, he wrote a confession that was published, and I used to have a copy of that, and I can't find it, by the Chicago publishing, not company or corporation, but it was a group appointed by the Baha'is of the United States in 1911. So this is before they had an LSA. They had the Baha'i Temple Unity at that point, but not the not an NSA. But they published the translation of this, and you can find this online. What his confession, and his confession indicts Mirza Muhammad Ali and says that he even took some of the writings, not only stole the writings and seal rings from Baha'u'llah's room when Abdul Baha was tending to the funeral of his father, but he also forged changes to some of the documents. So I mean, it's an incredible thing. And what's interesting was after he confessed and repented, he went back and continued being a covenant breaker after that. So go figure. I guess that's the danger of this disease. It doesn't go away easy. It's like a little pandemic of its own. From Baha'u'llah to the Guardian. Well, the main one we know are two sources. There are many who protested at first the appointment of the Guardian, and then after the appointment of the Guardian, the succession of the House of Justice. So from Abdul Baha, the Guardian, the most immediate members of his family, his entire family, even his mother and father, did not recognize his authority. He was a young man, and going from Abdul Baha to this young man was a challenge, and especially when they didn't even know such a position as Guardian would exist. Mirza Mabsora, if you read some of the early letters from Abdul Baha to the American community of the West, they will be translated by Mirza Mabsora. He was a translator and secretary to Abdul Baha and helped Shoghi Effendi for a while, but it wasn't that, as I understand it, so much that he didn't like Shoghi Effendi. He didn't think there should be an administrative order. He wanted it just to be a nice, spiritual thing without an administration. Kind of naive, of course, but that's my understanding. There's a whole story about him and what he went on to do and so on, but let me not get into that because we don't have time. From the Guardian to the House of Justice, of course, the main breaker of the covenant was a long time hand of the cause, Charles Mason Remy, and his successors, because they're after his demise, when he claimed to be the second Guardian, then one after him said, well, I'm the third Guardian, and someone after him said, I'm the fourth Guardian. So you can probably find that on Wikipedia if you're so inclined. And I'll tell you in a second how he claimed to be, why he said he had the right to be guardian. But first, let's finish up. Let me see if we can. I don't think we can, but we'll do a little more. Why can there be no more individual guardians? Well, the reason logically is the guardian had to appoint someone during his lifetime, either his firstborn or son or another lineal descendant of Baha'u'llah. And then they had to be approved by the House of Justice. Well, he had no children, and he did not appoint anyone else because there was no one else to appoint, because all of the lineal descendants of Baha'u'llah that were available to be appointed became covenant breakers. So there was no one to appoint. And so this, I didn't read it, but I'm not going to read the whole thing, but suffice to say, this is one of the first decisions that comes out of the House of Justice. They study the text, and after prayerful and careful study of the holy text, bearing upon the question, I guess I am going to read it, of the appointment of the successor to Shoghi Effendi as guardian of the cause of God, and after prolonged consultation, which included consideration of the views of the hands of the cause of God residing in the Holy Land, the Universal House of Justice finds there is no way to appoint or to legislate to make it possible to appoint a second guardian to succeed Shoghi Effendi. And that's it. That's the infallible decision. There not only cannot be one now, there's no way to make it possible in the future to make such an appointment happen. The logic is pretty easy to follow, as I said, but nevertheless, it was important for them to be absolutely sure before they could make this infallible decision, and that in effect didn't do away with the guardianship, but did away with the idea that there would ever be another individual guardian. And now the question that I began with, or I think I did, are there degrees of infallibility? And this is a quote, of course, that we read last week from the from the Will and Testament of Abdul Baha. Concerning the House of Justice, which God hath ordained as the source of all good and freed from all error, it must be elected by universal suffrage, that is, by the believers. But it's this particular passage that I'm looking at right now. Freed from all error. What does infallibility mean? Well, infallibility means without error, that it is correct. So can there be degrees? Is Baha'u'llah more infallible than the House of Justice, or is the House of Justice as infallible as the guardian? There are no degrees of infallibility. It does not, if it means without error, it means it's without error, period. So another point that we've already mentioned, don't need to read this, but this is a decision that was also made by the House of Justice, and that is explaining, it's not a decision, it's an observation that it says, during the 36 years of his guardianship, Shoghi Effendi functioned without the Universal House of Justice. Now the Universal House of Justice must function without the guardian, but the principle of inseparability, that is the inseparability of these twin institutions of the guardianship and the House of Justice, does not lose its significance nor position in the order of Baha'u'llah merely because there is no living guardian. And it goes on to explain. Then this, I will end with this. This is very important. It is not for individuals to limit the sphere of the guardian's authority or to judge when they have to obey the guardian and when they are free to reject his judgment. Such an attitude would evidently lead to confusion and schism. The guardian being appointed the interpreter of the teachings, it is his responsibility to state what matters which, affecting the interest of the faith, demand on the part of the believers complete and unqualified obedience to his instructions. And the same thing holds true for the House of Justice. So you can't say, well, they are infallible when they're talking about laws, creating laws, but not when they're just talking about everyday matters. No, their decisions are infallible and are to be followed on everything they decide. And the same is true with the Guardian. Now, the reason this came up, and I can't, again, I wish I could get into this more, maybe we will sometime. But the reason this came up, this question, was that the Guardian himself said, I'm not infallible about everything, just about things concerning the Baha'i faith. Well, he doesn't really talk about a whole lot else, does he? Well, the same thing's true with the House of Justice. It's not infallible about things not dealing with the faith, but it doesn't say anything that's not dealing with the Baha'i faith. All right. We end with these, which we looked at before. These are the twin institutions as they are now, the Guardianship down through the International Teaching Center, the counselors, the auxiliary board members, and their assistants in the community, and the rulers, the House of Justice, the National Assemblies. The regional council is really not part of that chain so far as they don't have authority. So that's why really this is a better look at it, where the regional councils are here elected by local assemblies, but the authority over them is by the National Assembly, not the local assemblies. And they don't rule over anybody. They govern the regional training institutes. They don't have a governing function. They are a teaching organization. But notice how they combine influences from here and from here. So we end with our beautiful picture of the Qibla, the burial place of Baha'u'llah, simple and yet the center of the world.